This is Topics in Ancient World History. I'm Dr. Young. I want to devote this video to a discussion of the Hebrews. This, of course, is an ancient people, primarily associated with the early Iron Age, maybe stretching back, though it's uncertain, into the late Bronze Age. Part of the problem here is that the narrative of the main source for the Hebrews, which of course is the Hebrew Bible, it's difficult to kind of corroborate that with other evidence and to tell. I mean, some of the stories that it purports to tell seem to go back, well into the Bronze Age, maybe even like 1,000 years into the Bronze Age. And some have tried to reconstruct the chronology and come up with dates for all of these things, right? But that's always an act of speculation. One of the things we should say about the Hebrews is even though they had a small kingdom that was eventually divided into two kingdoms, as you see on the map here, they were not important geopolitically. I mean, they were one of a number of small kingdoms in the western part of Asia here in the Levant region, right? You can see the kingdom of Aram Damascus, you can see the kingdom of Ammon, the kingdom of Moab, the kingdom of Edom. There were city-states among the Philistines in what is now the region called Gaza. There were city-states that were part of Phoenicia to the north of the Kingdom of Israel there. The Phoenicians were themselves, maritime merchants. They were also the developers of the first phonetic alphabet, which was copied by the Hebrews and other people, right? So there are a number of other peoples who existed in this region, and were it not for the Bible and for the kind of religious legacy that the Hebrews left, they would almost not even merit our attention. But because those things are so vitally important, the Bible as a historical source, and the tradition of monotheism as a key factor in the history of Western civilization and world history more generally, we need to pay attention to these people, right? So let's cover a few points here. And much of this comes from the Bible. There are a few things that we can corroborate with the Bible, though it's definitely later on, well into the Iron Age, that the archaeological evidence starts to correspond a little bit with the stories told in the Bible. And even there, it's an act of speculation or maybe making an imaginative leap to try to get to that connection. Now, there has been, archaeologists, for instance, have uncovered a tunnel that stretches from the ancient center of Jerusalem down to a spring just outside of what was, the ancient city. And this seems to be, the tunnel described in a story in the Bible associated with the reign of King Hezekiah when Israel was being attacked and besieged. They, had a tunnel that allowed them to get to a water source. And so that's one example of things that have been corroborated more or less, but that's not absolutely certain even then. When we talk about the foundation myths, stories of Abraham or Moses in the Exodus, right, there is no corresponding or corroborating evidence, at least nothing that is secure in any way, right? Like other Near Eastern peoples, and in fact like peoples all over the world in just about every civilization, there were foundation myths that were embraced by people that explained who they were, how they came into being as a people. According to the Hebrew foundation myth, the story of Abraham, there was a guy named Abram. Later he changed his name to Abraham as commanded by God. But Abram, who lived in Mesopotamia, was seemingly a polytheist, right? But then God approached him or appeared to him and said, you need to worship only me, and I need you to move, right, and go to this place that I promise you, which is this region shown on the map here, the Levant region, and that God was going to promise him a number of things. That story is problematic in many ways. It's not, there's a lot to say about it, but this is not the time or the place to do that, right? And Abraham, started a family, as it were. A couple generations on, there were a lot of children born to his grandson Jacob. But then, as the biblical narrative says, the Israelites ended up mostly in Egypt. Now, that actually makes sense because, as we've seen, the Nile Valley was a much more prosperous place than the Fertile Crescent, much more predictable. The the water sources were, less problematic and things like that, right? And Egypt was a well-protected and prosperous place. So it's understandable that people would have moved from a Fertile Crescent to Egypt, but according to the narrative, the pharaohs then enslaved the Hebrews, necessitating the intervention of God and through the calling and mission of the prophet Moses, right? And this is one of the foundational stories of Western civilization, where the Israelites or the Hebrews then move from Egypt back to the land that was promised to Abraham. Again, these are foundation myths. There are similar foundation myths in other cultures, other civilizations of this time and place. But these are the ones that have, I think, really gained traction in Western civilization, partly because the stories contain this notion that there is a single God, or at least that there is one God whom the Hebrews should worship. There are various names for God in the Bible. The one that is most common probably is a 4-consonant name that is usually not pronounced, or something is usually substituted for it. If it is pronounced, it comes across as something like Yahweh, or in the Greek, Jehovah, right? And so the Hebrews believed in the worship of Yahweh, and that was their cult. That's not to say they did not worship other gods. There's evidence in the Bible that often the Hebrews did worship other gods. They embraced gods of the surrounding cultures. But God kept trying to pull them back to this singular worship of only Him, right? Or only he, she, it. I don't know what pronouns to apply to God here. Okay. So monotheism is the great legacy of the Hebrews, and this will eventually gain traction. The Hebrew religion spread and became quite common all over the Eastern Mediterranean and even points beyond. But it's not until an offshoot of the Hebrew religion, which is Christianity, of course, that this becomes like one of the key factors, of the foundational components of Western civilization. That's beyond the scope, or that's very late in the ancient world that happens, but that is part of the legacy of the Hebrew religion. The Hebrews had some kingdoms in the Iron Age. Initially, according to the biblical narrative, this started out as a single kingdom centered on the city of Jerusalem. But it was, after a few generations, divided into 2 kingdoms, a northern kingdom called Israel, a southern kingdom which was called Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed and occupied by the Assyrians in the late 8th century. And as we've talked about, the Assyrians had a policy of forced assimilation and forced removal, and this effectively dealt a death blow to that culture, or it was changed irrevocably, right? Some of the people who were assimilated into Assyrian culture seem to have continued the practice of some form of the Hebrew religion, though it was changed and corrupted, at least according to the remaining Hebrews. And these people would later become called the Samaritans, right? Inhabitants of that region of Samaria. And this would create a rivalry within kind of the descendants of these ancient Hebrews. Stories in the Christian New Testament talk about the rivalries between the Jews and the Samaritans, for instance. The kingdom of Judah lasted for some longer time. It was not conquered by one of these large empires until the early 6th century BCE, when the Chaldean or Neo-Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar conquered it, and again attempted forced removal. But due to the intervention of the Persians, who later, only a few decades after that, conquered Babylon, the Persians, as we've said, were very tolerant, and they allowed the Hebrews who had been taken out of the kingdom of Judah to return and to kind of revitalize their religion and their society. And it's at this point that they start to be called Jews, and that's after the kingdom of Judah, right? That's where that name comes from. And so the origin of the Jews is, by that label, kind of dates to that time, about the 6th century BCE or so. Now, there's much more we could say about the narrative. The Hebrews never, with one exception, never again had an independent kingdom. In the 2nd century, they managed to wrest their independence for a few decades from the Seleucid Empire, which is one of the kind of holdovers of the remnants of the empire of Alexander the Great, under the Hasmonean dynasty, but shortly thereafter they were swallowed up by the Roman Empire and became Roman subjects. The last couple things the last kind of main point I want to make here is that this text that was produced by the ancient Hebrews is of tremendous importance for the study of at least of this region in the ancient world, right? There's a lot of evidence, not just about the Hebrews, but about surrounding empires, about the Egyptians, about the Assyrians, about the Chaldeans, about the Persians. And we can use this text as an entry point into some of that, at least into the ideas that people had about these cultures, right? The Hebrew reaction to the Assyrians or the Hebrew reaction to the Persians, and get a sense of the mindset of that time. This is not to say that every story told in the Bible, or any story told in the Bible for that matter, is historically accurate. That's not the point. Rather, the Bible allows for an entry point into ancient mentalities. There were three parts of the Hebrew Bible, and we're really only talking here about the Old Testament, as the Christians call it. But there were three parts of the Hebrew Bible. These were compiled at different times. They were almost certainly written by disparate communities over a very long period of time, probably several centuries, maybe even close to a millennium or more. The earliest part, which was only compiled and reached final form maybe in the 5th century or so, sometime in the middle of the first millennium BCE anyway, was called the Torah. This is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And this contains, a story of creation, which was that sort of thing was common in ancient societies. There's a story about a flood, another kind of common trope that we find in many ancient societies. And then, of course, the story of the Exodus. And a lot of legal material, a lot of stuff about how people should behave, right? And so some of that will be assigned reading in this class. A second part of the Hebrew Bible was added later, though some of the texts almost certainly date to earlier times. But it reached its final form probably around the end of the 3rd century BCE. This is called the Nevi'im in Hebrew. Translated, that would be the writings of the prophets. And prophets are these key figures in the history recounted in the Bible. They are mouthpieces for God. They're kind of like, they fulfill a similar function that Socrates does in ancient Athens. They're gadflies. They try to warn people to change their behavior or God's going to be angry with them. In some cases, they can even wield great power given to them by God. We get into supernatural elements and miracles and things like this, right? So the writings of the prophets, there are, long prophetic books like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and there are shorter prophetic books kind of the last books in the sort of typical order of the Old Testament, right? Books like Zechariah and Haggai and Obadiah and Jonah and Micah and so forth and so on, okay? So, and then finally, there's a group that are simply called the writings, or the Ketuvim in Hebrew. These would be things like the Psalms, which seem to be songs or poems from ancient Israel that were probably part of worship services, and the historical books, like the books of Kings and Chronicles, that were compiled to tell the stories about the people of Israel, or stories like the book of Job, which seem to recount the deeds of a believer in Yahweh, though disconnected from any specific context, right? And the writings did not reach final form, or were not added to the Hebrew Bible until the 1st century CE. And so this book, which we call the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, had about a 500-year compilation history, and maybe close to a 1,000 or even more long year writing history, right? It is an incredibly complex text, a lot of great information, but one that you have to treat with some care. Last comment. In the Hebrew Bible, we find a tradition of a deliverer. Because the Hebrews were often subsumed under larger empires, starting with the Assyrians and later others. In the prophetic writings in particular, though to some extent you can find this if you read it from a certain vantage point in the writings. There is a tradition that God will send a deliverer, right? In Hebrew, the word is Mashiach, which means the anointed one. And there were a number of claimants to the title of Messiah in the ancient world. The most famous one, of course, is Jesus of Nazareth, who was called Christ. Christ is simply the Greek translation of the word Messiah. It also means the anointed one, okay? And so this is a tradition to be aware of. Jesus was not the only claimant to that title. There were different claimants who had kind of different bases to claim to be the Messiah in the ancient world, and even thereafter, right? There are more modern claimants to the same title. So hopefully that gives you some good information about the Hebrews, some good context that will allow you then to have a productive inquiry into the assigned text from the Hebrew Bible. Thanks.